the NATO chief has mocked a broken Russian submarine. Uh, the NATO chief has mocked Russia over the limping condition of one of its submarines as Russian authorities denied it had been forced to surface because of technical problems. Okay. Black Sea is the body of water on the far side of the Bosporus, of the, basically it's the body of water that Ukraine, Crimea faces onto, plus Russia, plus Turkey. It's where, Russia has a fleet, and keeping the Dardanelles open is one thing to allow the Black Sea Fleet access to the Mediterranean and therefore to blue water. The issue has been about, there's been talks or there's been rumours in the past about the idea that Turkey might close the straits to Russian military vessels, which goes down all sorts of interesting complications in terms of the United Nations Conventions on Laws of the Sea and Transit Passage and Innocence Passage and things like that. The Russians claim that they've relocated one of their submarines from the Black Sea or the Mediterranean around to the Baltic or around to the Arctic, but basically out in the more open waters. They've run one of their submarines on the surface through the English Channel. And so people are saying, the Russians had a severe malfunction and therefore that's why it's running on the surface. Now, the Russians have said, nope. Other people said, yeah, and that it's also on the tow and that it's broken and everything else. Okay. It's true that there's hardly any Russian naval presence in the Mediterranean, in part because Turkey's kind of being a bit annoying in terms of they're not necessarily requesting for the Black Sea Fleet to leave. I mean, the Black Sea Fleet is quite honestly quite busy with what's been going on between Russia and Ukraine and protecting the various Russian assets that front the Black Sea. So they're not going to be moving from the Black Sea out into the Mediterranean. So whatever's in the Med has probably come in from either from Murmansk or Kaliningrad or St. Petersburg. I think that's the place. So coming out of the Baltic or around the top through by the Arctic. It's more than likely, though, that they would have sent vessels out from the Black Sea Fleet in the past, but at the moment they've got bigger things that they're worried about. So obviously, it passing on the surface, perfectly fine. So they're being shadowed and stuff. Again, that's not necessarily an issue. The fact that they're sending naval units to monitor and observe, everybody does that, to be quite honest. The Russian Black Sea Fleet said the submarine is conducting a scheduled interfleet transit after completing tasks in the Med. Perfectly fine. The thing, though, is when we talk about unnecessary rhetoric and anger and useless reporting and stuff that to people who understand the laws of the sea or the various international laws pertaining to territories and territorial limits and things like that, it makes it seems very scary, a lot of the terminology being used. And this isn't necessarily just being focused on what Russia does. It's a ramping up of rhetoric that, quite honestly, doesn't need to be said. In fact, there shouldn't be anything about it. It's like talking about patrol aircraft approaching international airspace, or so national airspace limits, up to the 12-mile limit and everything else like that. We talked about this previously at length about the fact that, okay, in an ADIS, they're probably going to be identified, but there is no obligation. There is being a polite member of the international community in terms of notification, but there is no requirement for that notification to go ahead. So when you have statements like this coming out, it particularly when it's clear that there is no breach and there is no threat and there is no issue with what is going on, it's not one nation pushing, not the One Nation Party in Australia, but it's not a nation pushing the limits of what is acceptable. They're acting completely within the boundaries of international law. It's the response which is out of order and is excessive for what should have been. Now, why am I saying all this? Okay, a submarine running on the surface through the English Channel. There's a couple of elements of the international law, so UNCLOS, which is the governing international set of agreements and laws, and we've talked about this in terms of airspace. Now we're looking at this in terms of water space. There's two parts to it, and I've talked about in the past the idea of a transit, of a straits transit. We're going to go with the Wikipedia stuff. I mean, I could go into the actual UN conventions and dig deep, but look, we'll stick with the Wikipedia because it's a nice high-level overview, and it has enough of the correct information to show that what the Russians are doing is completely fine, and it was the NATO response, or it's the response by Rutka that's well and truly out of line, and is not a case of, well, we're dealing with a pariah. It's, I mean, the French boarding the Shadow Fleet tanker/cargo vessel a few weeks ago, perfectly fine. There's existing allowances in the various international laws for doing so, and there's stuff out there that can be looked at. It's fairly available to be looked at in terms of operational law, what military commanders and operators will get to look at in terms of, or consider when engaging in a military action or engaging military assets to carry out an action, not necessarily combat, but particularly when you're dealing with nominally neutral or civilian platforms, and what you can and can't do and what you can expect to do. And it also then goes into operational law, also goes into what rights and roles exist for neutral parties and belligerents, and what counts as a neutral party in terms of if a nation or a body is doing certain actions, they can't claim neutrality and may present themselves as legitimate targets and all that sort of stuff. Which is why I've been saying what I've been saying. It's not a case of I'm picking one side or another. I'm looking at it from a position of what the laws of armed conflict present, what constitutes war crimes, which influences the laws of arms conflict as well, and what the various international treaties and laws that are out there have to say. And when you put all that stuff together, you realise that the situation, one, isn't the way the media seems to report it. Two, that there is complying with the intent and the letter of the law. Now, sometimes people will comply with the intent but not the letter, and other times people will comply with the letter but not the intent of the various laws and treaties and obligations and things like that. When you take all that into consideration, you realise that a lot of this stuff that is being couched in inflammatory terms in the media and by politicians and people like that really isn't. It's fairly routine procedures and operations. It's just that people who've not had experience with it or don't understand the underlying background to it tend to get all excited and can get wound up very quickly as a result. The drawback being then that allows people to apply pressure on politicians, and well, politicians ultimately make the decision what happens with the militaries, and bad things can happen as a result. Not because there was a hostile act or hostile intent. These are completely benign, neutral operations, but through the lens of somebody who doesn't understand what they're looking at, it's like, well, no. So, yeah, it's not taking sides. It's, well, take the side of peace, but it's encouraging people to slow down and actually have a look at what's going on. So, with that said, there's two aspects here. The first one is the transit passage, and this is what I've said about in terms of archipelagic transits and straits transits and things like that. Now, I'm not going to go into the definition of a strait or an archipelagic transit under the convention or anything like that. We're going to accept that a vessel transiting through the English Channel, which is what this submarine was doing, and eventually the Denmark Straits, it's called something else, but anyway, but these are locations where straits transit are considered to be in effect because there's no high seas or EEZs belonging to the nations on either side, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so all ships and aircraft enjoy the right of transit passage. Cool. Hopefully no one's in disagreement with that. Now, and this is also then Turkey's rhetoric and the rhetoric pushed by other people about Turkey having the ability or should be able to block the Russians from taking their Black Sea fleet or merchant traffic out of the Black Sea and into the Med or back in the other direction. You can't do that. You can't close the straits arbitrarily like that. Now, Russia and Turkey have been fairly friendly in the past, but you can't make a stop like that because the moment you do that, well, that opens a huge can of worms for other things, and people tend to rely on these allowances for their own military or their own civil things. You're risking, the moment you start doing things like this, you risk shutting down major global shipping routes. I mean, the Straits of Hormuz, the Malacca Straits, the Formosa Strait, even the access to the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal. I mean, they're under their own special considerations. So, in accordance, right of navigation and overflight solely for the purpose of continuous and expeditious transit between one part of the high seas and another part. So what that means is, once you enter, you keep going until you get out the far end. You can't stop and look and do other things along the way. Now, if you're suffering mechanical issue or other issue preventing your ability to continue, some places there's setups to allow for that, like turnout zones and other bits and pieces. But basically, once you enter, you carry on until you get out the backside. All right. Whilst not all countries have ratified the convention, pretty much everybody agrees that this is the way you do things. They accept the rules. Okay, so so we come down to transit passage exists for all straits used for international navigation where there is not a simple alternate route, and excludes those instances where there's a long-standing international convention governing the straits, such as the Danish Straits, Turkish Straits, Straits of Magellan, and the Beagle Channel. Now, major international trade routes are the Strait of Gibraltar, so in other words, access to the Mediterranean from the Atlantic, Dover Strait, which is the English Channel, Hormuz, access to the Arabian Gulf, access to the Red Sea and access through the Malaccas from the Indian Ocean to, well, the Philippine Sea, West Philippine Sea, South China Sea. It depends on who you want to call it. And then the canals, major canals, have their own treaties. Okay, so we understand that vessels are allowed to do this. It goes throughout the entire strait, not just the overlapping areas. Ships and aircraft of all nations, including warships, enjoy the right of unimpeded transit in such straits and their approaches. Cool. Submarines are free to transit international straits submerged, since that is their normal mode of operation. Transit passenger rights do not exist in any state's internal waters. Okay, so internal waters, yep, everything else. Now, we're not concerned about that. So, the Russian submarine transiting the English Strait, so the English Channel, the Dover Strait, and thus the English Channel, has every right to do so while submerged, according to the conventions on the law of the sea. Okay, so the Russians so far are allowed to be there. They're actually allowed to have their submarine running under the surface, as long as it's going south to north and north to south, in accordance with it. There's a related concern called Innocence Passage. So an Innocence Passage is a concept in the law of the sea that allows for a vessel to pass through the territorial seas and certain grandfathered internal waters of another state, subject to certain restrictions. So this is more, the way I was taught it was more that it's the archipelagic transits, or it's things like port visits or anything else. These are the sort of things that when piracy is being considered or being defended against by civil traffic off, say, off Somalia there for a while, plus in other high piracy regions around the world, it's why they're not carrying armed guards into port, because of the right of innocent passage. You can't, well, we'll look at it as we go through it, but you can't have armed, postured guards, and you lose your rights to certain merchant traffic if you do. Even militaries can't be doing certain things, can't have activated weapons, all that sort of stuff. There's limits on what you can and can't do in terms of innocent passage, because you're entering another nation's territory at this point. Now, that may mean there may be a means for you to navigate between islands and things like that, but it's considered that nation's territory, and in essence, you're there as a guest. Now, you may be there without their permission. Again, permitted to do that, but you need to observe certain conventions about what you do or don't do. Main thing is, it's innocent so long as it's not prejudicial to the peace, good order, security of the coastal state. In other words, don't do something to upset the people whose waters it is. As long as you do that, everybody's cool. All right. You cannot exercise or practice with weapons of any kind. So these merchant vessels that bring aboard security teams cannot have those security teams aboard while entering a place where they're partaking in innocent passage. In the high seas, not a problem. Inside somebody's territorial limits, they can't have it. All right, so you'll generally see at sea onboarding and offboarding of these security teams because the rules prevent them from bringing them inside territorial waters, because in essence you're now relying on the security, the maritime security of the adjacent state to provide that security. Now, the fact that some states can't provide that security or don't provide it very well, that's a separate issue. Any act collecting information, so in other words, intel collection, is generally precluded. Active propaganda aimed at affecting the defence of security, yep. Launching, landing, or taking board of any aircraft. So from the military, you're talking about aircraft carrier operations, landing ship, helos, helicopter issues, launching, landing, or taking on board of any military device, gathering intel, etc. Loading or unloading of commodity, etc., contrary to the rules. Active pollution, fishing, territorial EEZs have rules on that too. Research or survey activities, etc. Acts aimed at interfering with any system of comms. Well, as long as they get caught doing it, I guess. So that'd be things like dragging anchor cables to break internet and telecommunication. So dragging anchors to break submarine cables. That sort of stuff inside territorial waters. Yeah, naughty, naughty, naughty. I mean, generally most people are upset with that anyway. The key thing here is underwater vehicles like submarines are required by the treaty to surface and show their flags during innocent passage. It applies during the territorial seas. It's similar to transit passage, but has the different requirements because of all this and the fact submarines come to the surface. So we go back and look at what Russia was doing with their submarine as they were going through the English Channel. Now, I can't see on that picture whether or not it's got flags out, but then again, I can't see if the French have their flags out either. But for it to be on the surface running like that, they're engaged in innocent passage. They're allowed to do that. We just looked at it. The laws explicitly permit them to do that activity. They appear just to be transiting, at least according to even the article stuff. And the fact then that they then meet up with a submarine tender at sea, there's plenty of nations have and use submarine tenders. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's been suffered a major mechanical issue. Now, yeah, there is plenty of Russian military hardware that in the past has suffered from severe mechanical reliability issues, but there is no indication here that anything other than a innocent passage has been engaged in. So we've seen that the laws establish that. Now, NATO well and truly understand this sort of stuff. And there's a lone and broken Russian submarine limping home from patrol. And this is coming from the NATO's Sec General, NATO's chief, basically. He's mocked Russia over the limping condition of one of its submarines because it was running on the surface. Now, the Russians said it's to comply with navigation rules in the channel. Okay, we just showed that the transit passage is what applies during the English Channel, and that, if anything, the Russians are exercising innocent passage because they're running their submarine on the surface. Given the bathymetry of the English Channel, I suspect it's probably fairly dangerous to be running a submarine submerged north to south through the English Channel, and that running it on the surface is a safety thing. So it seems again that we have belligerents, we have people making claims and fanning flames that don't exist. That, well, the only reason they exist is because the people making these claims want them to exist. That the thing that they're targeting is completely innocent. And I don't understand how this encourages peaceful interaction, how it encourages anything other than ongoing suspicion and not fear, but reluctance by various nations to engage, not in military engage, but to be open and honest with each other. And it makes NATO look like clowns. if you want people to believe you and to trust you when you're talking about more violent outcomes or conflict that's underway, and you want us to believe your position and that what you're telling us is true in regards to that, don't be making a mountain out of nothing when it is quite clear by all the rules out there that the activities you're upset about are completely permitted. Then there's nothing in them that is hostile, and it removes trust. I mean, we've talked at length about other aspects of society at the moment where trust has been eroded, and so you come out with things like this that's going to erode trust in your organisation, trust in what you can do.